If there's one thing bigots hate, it's being held accountable for their bigotry. And that's why Greg gets all prickly whenever folks calls him out. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. We's down to the nitty-gritty here with a collection of what Greg calls mini-tactics. Little rhetorical maneuvers that weren't worth a whole chapter in themselves, but that Greg thinks is worth mentioning. And today we's picking up with a mini-tactic he calls sticks and stones. Quote, like steamroller, this is a defensive tactic. It's a maneuver to protect you from a certain type of ad hominem attack, name-calling. Here's how it works. Whenever anyone tries to deflect your point by labeling you with a nasty name, bigot, homophobe, Islamophobe, racist, whatever, always ask for a definition. End quote. I wonder why folks would be calling Greg a bigot or a homophobe or Islamophobe or a racist. Could it be because he preaches stuff that's bigoted, homophobic, Islamophobic, and racist? Well, I do declare, I think it just might be the bigoted things he says that leads folks to call him a bigot. Funny how that works, ain't it? Greg calls this an ad hominem attack, which sounds like the famous ad hominem fallacy. But apologists is often too quick to cry ad hominem in a debate where they's advocating bigoted views. An ad hominem fallacy is when you try to argue that someone's conclusion is false just because they's a bad person somehow. But if someone says things that's bigoted and you call it out as bigotry, that ain't a fallacy. You ain't making an argument or claiming to refute the other person's argument. You's just identifying the character of the claims they's making. And that's only fair. Folks deserves to be held accountable for their toxic behavior. On the other hand, while that's true, it does make it easier for the apologist to play the martyr and obscure the issue by diverting the discussion into an argument over whether you's committing a fallacy or not. And that's the strategy that Greg is proposing here. If someone identifies you as a bigot when you say bigoted things, try and change the subject into an argument about definitions. It's a great way to gaslight folks and play the martyr. And when all is said and done, all you has to do is say, well, you don't agree with the other person's definitions, and hey, presto, you have successfully, quote unquote, defended your position. So the best way to deal with this tactic is to avoid giving the apologist the chance to use it in the first place. Don't call folks bigots. Instead, focus on their behavior and their preaching and explain why that can be fairly described as bigotry. That is, don't say, you're a homophobe. Say, irrational hostility towards gays is homophobic. That way they can't ask you to define homophobic because you just done defined it already. For example, we can say, the only difference between homosexuals and heterosexuals is in how they fall in love. Everything else in a homosexual relationship has an exact counterpart in heterosexual relationships. And falling in love differently don't do no harm to nobody. That's why it's hateful and bigoted to subject folks to slander and abuse just 'cause they falls in love differently than you do. Now, at that point, all Greg is going to have left to say is to claim that his God declared homosexuality to be sinful, at which point you can remind him that according to the doctrine of the Trinity, God is a union of three distinct persons, and each of them persons is male, even the Holy Spirit according to John 16:13. And that means that God is, by nature, a same-sex union. So them verses in the Bible that's famous for hating on gays ain't likely to have really come from him. Yes, you can interpret the Bible however you like to justify hating whoever you want to hate, but that don't make you any less of a bigot, nor does it make God guilty of your bigotry. God ain't objectively here to speak up for himself, so that means you's responsible all on your own for how you conduct yourself in his absence. Anyways, back to Greg. There's a second part to this mini-tactic. Quote, Once he spells out what he means, ask him why his definition applies to you. Then ask why he thinks it's helpful to impugn your character instead of showing where your idea went wrong. Ridicule is not an argument after all. End quote. And he's right. Ridicule ain't an argument. Ridicule is a way of holding folks accountable when they preaches antisocial and abusive policies, targeting folks just for being different in ways that don't hurt nobody. And it works. When folks like Greg complain about censorship and quote-unquote cancel culture, what they saying is that they don't like being ridiculed for saying hateful stuff. It makes them feel bad. It takes away their enthusiasm for promoting bigoted, antisocial opinions. And that's a good thing. Greg, you deserve ridicule for the ridiculously hateful things you's preaching. You should be ashamed of your shameful and intolerant cruelty. What you's doing is harmful to society as a whole, and those of us who has a conscience needs to do whatever we can to stop you from taking our culture down into a cesspit of immorality and injustice. And the sooner you repent, the better off we'll all be, even you. One last comment here, and then we'll move on. There is one case where we ought to use Greg's tactic ourselves, and that's if anybody calls us woke. We should demand a precise definition of what woke is and why it's supposedly so bad. I ain't sure what they'll say, but it might lead to an interesting discussion. Greg's next mini-tactic is called moving toward the objection. Quote, here's the inspired insight. Sometimes it's better to move towards an objection rather than away from it, to embrace a charge rather than run from it. End quote. Or, in other words, if and you can't deny a particular charge, at least make it sound like it's no big deal. You can trivialize what the other fellow is saying by agreeing with them and then brushing it off as inconsequential. As an example, he cites an exchange he had during a debate with Michael Shermer. Quote, Shermer pointed out that if the Bible is a guide to morality, then I'd have to pick and choose which biblical commands to embrace. My response, you're absolutely right, Michael. Yes, I explained, I would have to do the hard work of sorting the rules out, but that's true of every ethical system, even his. End quote. And this is kind of a tone of voice debating strategy. Agree with your opponent with such an air of confidence and superiority that your supporters will think you scoring a point, even though you've actually given one away. If in Bible-based morality ain't a better guide to morality than secular alternatives, then it ain't the infallible guide that Greg is trying to claim it is. When you decide by human effort which biblical moral imperatives is valid, that's an appeal to some kind of more reliable moral standard outside the Bible. So Greg is conceding that he ain't using the Bible as his real guide to real morality, even though he's claiming moral authority based on the Bible. And he glosses over that by making this concession as if it was no big deal. His calm, confident demeanor, as he says it, is enough to reassure his supporters that he's still scoring points in the debate. Meanwhile, what he's just admitted is that when he decided that biblical condemnations of homosexuality is valid, he's doing so not based on the Bible, but based on his own personal subjective prejudices. In other words, the reason he don't reject the homophobic passages the same way he rejects passages about slavery is because he likes the homophobic passages. He's claiming biblical authority for what's really just his own personal homophobia, and he concedes that the Bible is not his actual source. He's just using tone of voice and rhetorical posturing to trivialize this confession, and that's what makes him deserve to be ridiculed as a homophobe and a bigot. So the counter tactic here is to emphasize whatever the apologist is trying to trivialize. Point out the fact that since he's picking and choosing which moral teachings is applicable to today, he's personally accountable for his own choices and deserves to be held accountable for the ones that's bigoted and antisocial. That's the part he's trying to gloss over, so that's the part that needs to be called out and emphasized. So let's go on and look at some more examples that Greg gives and see what else needs to be called out. Quote, challenge. The church is filled with hypocrites. MTO. Actually, the church is filled with worse people than hypocrites. Liars, swindlers, fornicators, adulterers, drunks, self-centered egoists, sinners of all sorts. That's why they need Jesus. End quote. And MTO there stands for moving toward the objection, in case that weren't clear. So what's the underlying issue here? What is it that Greg's trying to gloss over? Well, the key is in how he's phrasing the challenge. And you'll hear this a lot from preachers and apologists using just those terms. I can't tell you how many times I've heard evangelists talk about how everybody says the church is full of hypocrites. But I can't recall even once where somebody outside the church ever used the term hypocrites as an indictment against the church. That ain't something that folks normally says. But the apologist says it that way because that makes it easier to use the excuse that believers is struggling to do better. Of course they sin, and that's why they need a Savior to save them from their sins. Or so the excuse goes. But that ain't the real problem here. Greg's trying to make it sound like the church is some kind of self-help group like Alcoholics Anonymous, where folks who's struggling with sin goes to encourage each other not to sin so much. But the church is supposed to be way more than just an ordinary self-help group. The church is supposed to bring people to Jesus to be saved from their sins and to fill them with the Holy Spirit, who will empower them with wisdom and the strength to resist temptations. And that means if God was real, we ought to see a remarkable change in the lives of believers once they get saved. And we don't. It ain't that Christians is quote-unquote hypocrites. It's that the amazing transformation that ought to be there and that the Bible promises will be there ain't there. That's more than just hypocrisy. That's a broken promise. What's worse, in many cases, the church don't even work as well as secular self-help groups, because the secular groups usually takes advantage of trained therapists and scientific research into how best to help folks overcome toxic behaviors. Whereas the church's ability to help depends on who all is members of the church. And in some cases, you'll get toxic church members and even toxic preachers reinforcing each other's toxic behaviors instead of actually helping. I'm looking at you, Greg Locke. So it ain't just that the church needs Jesus. It's that it's far too obvious that they ain't got him. And that's why we should say no thank you when they tries to sell him to us. Next challenge, quote, challenge, there's so much evil and suffering in the world, how can there be a God? MTO, of course there's so much evil in the world. That's what you'd expect if the Christian account is true. The Bible doesn't just explain it, it predicts it. We live in a world humans broke, and a broken world produces broken people and broken situations, end quote. The problem here is that in order for the Christian account to be true, it must first be consistent with itself. And the part of the Christian narrative that tries to pin the blame on fallible humans is a contradiction of the part that describes God as all-wise, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. A God like that would be able to achieve whatever result he wanted without any need to turn to sin and evil for help, even assuming that sin and evil had some kind of power to create more good than God could do on his own without their help. So if the Christian God was real, then sin and evil would not exist, and God wouldn't need to try and blame everything on weak and fallible humans. There wouldn't be nothing to blame them for, because God would have got it right on the first try without needing any help from sin and evil. Greg's MTO tactic tries to sweep this all under the rug as if it weren't no big deal, but this right here falsifies the entire Christian narrative all by itself. So there's that. Next challenge. Quote, challenge, Jesus is a crutch. God is a crutch. MTO, you're right. Handicapped people need crutches though. We need God to help us, to hold us up, and to forgive us. End quote. And the problem here is that imaginary crutches can do more harm than no crutches at all, because you go to lean on them and there ain't nothing there to support you. And you can hurt yourself trying to act like you's getting the support anyway. Not to mention all the times where you get folks carrying around crutches so they can use them to beat other folks over the head, so to speak. If you has a fear of social inadequacy and you feel like Jesus gives you the courage to face the world, well, that's fine. But if you's going to take your belief in Jesus and say that that gives you the right to harass transgendered kids so bad they give up on life, you ain't using your crutches to help yourself. You's using them to abuse others. And we got way too many believers like Greg who's doing exactly that. Next challenge. Quote, challenge. Your God committed genocide when he destroyed the Canaanites. MTO. Of course God destroyed them. If you had witnessed the things they did, including burning thousands of children and even infants alive in sacrifice to Molech, you would have asked, how could there be a God who allows these people to do such evil? It wasn't genocide, it was judgment. End quote. And golly, there's so much wrong here, it's hard to know where to start. But let's start with the challenge. It weren't that God destroyed the Canaanites, it's that God allegedly commanded the Israelites to commit genocide. And that's important because if God can command Israelites to commit genocide, that sets a precedent that other Christian leaders can follow to justify genocide against other folks. And you can say that God ain't commanding any other genocide, but can you really prove that? These kinds of claims is unfalsifiable by design, and they can and will be and are used by believers to promote all kinds of atrocities. And Greg's glossing over all that by pretending that God destroyed the Canaanites directly without using human agents. Secondly, according to the story, they was folks in Canaan who supposedly was doing these awful things, but it weren't everybody. Yet God supposedly commanded the Israelites to put everybody to violent death, including kids who was too little to even be able to do stuff like that. God supposedly commanded Israel to kill children and infants because when Canaanites kill children and infants, that's bad. Irony much? Thirdly, Greg says we would ask, how could God allow such evil? But according to the story, God did allow that kind of evil. He didn't prevent it, even though he could easily have done so. He allowed supposedly thousands of children and infants to be burned alive first. Then he commanded the rest of the children and infants to be violently murdered along with all the other Canaanites. The genocide don't solve the problem of God supposedly allowing child sacrifice. It makes it all worse. Fourthly, the nation of Israel is a group that emerged out of the Canaanite people, not a separate and distinct group from the Canaanites. Back when child sacrifice was being practiced, Israel was part of Canaan and shared the same culture, including the child sacrifices. That's why they had no problem with the story of God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son, or with the story of Jephthah sacrificing his daughter. This notion of God using his chosen people to punish some distinct other group ain't historically accurate. And finally, this whole story of the conquest of Canaan is fictional. Israel was never enslaved in Egypt, never had a real exodus, and never rampaged across Palestine, stealing land and murdering Palestinians. Or at least not before the rise of modern Zionism, they didn't. That don't let the Bible off the hook, though, because the writers of the Old Testament is still portraying this kind of conduct as being typical of the character of the Old Testament God. And modern Christians is still telling us that this is the God they worship and that they approve of his actions. And that's bad. Next up, quote, challenge. Every culture has a flood story like you have in the Bible. It's just a myth. MTO. Of course every culture has a flood story of some sort. That's just what you'd expect if there really was a flood that wiped out most of the human population. Do you think that every culture independently invented a fiction like that? End quote. And I'm going to call shenanigans on this one because that so-called challenge is a creationist talking point, not a skeptical challenge. Early civilizations started when tribes of hunter-gatherers began cultivating crops, which need to be watered. So, of course, early civilizations tended to settle around rivers and river deltas where the soil was fertile and there was a reliable source of water. And one of the hazards that comes from living near a river is that sometimes you get floods, which superstitious folks is likely to attribute to some god or spirit or other getting mad. So, yes, civilizations that's based on living near rivers or other large bodies of water do have myths about floods. We don't need any actual gods to explain why primitive cultures has flood myths. And besides, it ain't true that all cultures has them. Japan don't. African cultures, with few exceptions, don't have them. In Egypt, where the annual floods was more beneficial than cataclysmic, the closest they has to a Genesis-style flood myth is the story of Ra and Sekhmet, where Ra sent Sekhmet out killing folks for whatever reason, and the other gods poured out a huge flood of red wine to fool Sekhmet into thinking it was blood so she'd get drunk on it and pass out and stop killing folks. So the flood in this story actually saved humanity, it didn't destroy them. And there's even an annual wine drinking festival celebrating this quote-unquote flood. And no, different cultures didn't each invent a flood myth independently. Stories like Genesis myth show a strong influence from the flood myths of neighboring cultures, adapted to suit the specifics of the early Canaanite religion. And you can find similar influences in other religions that have similar stories as well. Again, it don't take no gods nor any kind of global flood for myths like that to arise the way they do. It's just like myths about heroes saving innocent folks from monsters. That's just the way human storytelling works. And one final challenge. Challenge. That's just your interpretation. MTO. You're right, that is my interpretation. How about this? Let me read the whole passage to you, and then you let me know from the context what you think I got wrong and why. End quote. What's cool about interpretations is that everybody has one that's uniquely their own. And the problem with interpretations is that everybody has one that's uniquely their own. Martin Luther thought that Christians ought to base their religion on what the Bible teaches. But different folks interpret the Bible in different ways, and so Protestantism exploded in hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of different denominations. And that ain't even counting all the non-denominational churches out there that couldn't even find one denomination that they agreed with. The problem is that there ain't no way to reliably and consistently measure a Bible interpretation to see if it's objectively correct. As we saw last time, it's trivially easy to turn the Bible into a ventriloquist dummy, even without meaning to, just by constructing an artificial context that adds in ideas that weren't in the original text. Greg himself gives us an example of taking a passage where Jesus tells his disciples not to judge, and then Greg suggests a context that turns that commandment on its head so as Jesus comes out telling Christians it's okay to judge all you want. And everybody can do that. That's why there's so many different flavors of Christianity. And that'd be okay if it was just a case of literary preferences, but folks like Greg wants to use their interpretation of the Bible as a license to harass and abuse and maybe even kill innocent folks. And that's downright criminal. Greg's strategy here is to try and lure the unbeliever into an endless quibble over semantics and context and theology and whatnot, where Greg's own training and experience will give him an advantage. But we shouldn't let ourselves get suckered into that. Instead, we should point out that even Christians ain't got any method that's guaranteed to give a consistent answer to the question of what the Bible teaches. And until they do, anybody's personal interpretation of the Bible is just an ordinary, fallible opinion, and you can't use it to justify discriminating against innocent folks. And that's as far as we're going to get today. A lot of short little snippets, some rather longer responses, but that's just the nature trying to correct folks who's drawn false conclusions based on false assumptions. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to finish off the last two mini tactics, and we might even get into a bit of the following chapter. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.